Chapter 2. The Second Labor, How Hercules Destroyed a Certain Terrible Hydra. Every schoolboy knows that Hercules, before he went to heaven, smote and slew a frightful monster, denominated the Lernaean Hydra. This hydra was an enormous reptile of a species now happily extinct. The researches of the most diligent naturalists have as yet failed to discover an individual of the serpent or of the lizard tribes rejoicing in the possession of more than a single head, though perhaps a dicephalous alligator may be found one of these days in Kentucky. But the hydra, according to the most moderate computation, had 7 heads, while another account gives it 50, and a third, just as likely to be correct as either of the other two, 100. On one of these heads being cut off, 2 more sprang up in its place, and very likely it was from suffering frequent decapitation at the hands of heroes, that the creature, endowed with 7 heads to begin with, came to have 100 in the end. The above facts, and the circumstance that the Lernaean hydra was a very poisonous and rapacious vermin, and as such had made itself highly obnoxious to the neighborhood, are all that we know about its natural history. We read, however, that it was the offspring of one Echidna, a she-dragon or griffin, by Typhon, who was the evil principal. This is an important point, and the reader, it is hoped, will duly bear it in mind. Now, the Lernaean hydra, it would seem, had a sort of soul, which of course our hero was unable to smash. This soul underwent a long series of transmigrations, inhabiting successively the bodies of various wolves, hyenas, sharks, crocodiles, rattlesnakes and boa constrictors, till at last it again animated a frame like its original tenement, which, ampler details having been handed down to us concerning it, we are enabled more fully to describe. This modern hydra was a gigantic monster, like unto a winged serpent as to its body, and having large and powerful claws or talons, which, whenever they once got prey into their clutches, were never known to let it go. It had heads almost innumerable, which were continually increasing from day to day. These heads were as the heads of men, and upon them were gray wigs which resembled wigs of horse hair. Of the wigs, some were short and close-cropped, with a few stiff rolls of curls at their sides and back, wherefrom also depended certain tails which were called pigtails. Others were long and flowing, with great luxuriant curls like those which ascend from the bowl of a tobacco pipe. In the mouth of each head were fangs as of adders, and likewise double tongues. These tongues possessed the faculty of speech, which they employed after the manner of the first speaking serpent on record, namely, to cajole and deceive, which objects they accomplished by 2 arts now lost to the world, but whose revival is scarcely to be wished for: sophistry and humbug. By sophistry they enlisted the intellect, by humbug the passions, of their hearers against the truth. The said tongues, moreover, were endowed with another power, which they would very frequently exercise, that of overbearing, confounding and bullying, however, being very glib and oily, they were quite able to flatter and speak fair on occasion. Some of the tongues of this hydra possessed the privilege of slaying with a word. The heads which they resided in were those with the huge curly wigs, and when they were about to be thus fatally employed, the big wig was surmounted by a cap of black velvet, very awful to behold. Among the hydra's heads there were not a few which had no wigs at all. Their faces were as the faces of foxes, very cunning-looking and sly. By contemporaneous writers they are said to have had a 6 and 8 penny expression of countenance, a phrase the meaning of which is, in the present day, somewhat obscure. The evil and mischief which this monster had occasioned in his time are almost incredible. His worst quality was, that he was ever a willing tool in the hands of any one who would feed and stuff him, and enable him to batten on the garbage of mammon. He would allow himself to be hounded on anybody, no matter whom, for a consideration. If a rich man wanted to dispossess a poor one of his little all, there was this hydra ever to be hired for a golden bribe, to be let loose, barking with 1, 2, or more mouths, according to the reward, at the needy wretch, till at last it drove him off his premises. Was there a mercenary troll who had inveigled some superannuated dotard into a promise of marriage? The hydra was at her service to invoke, by raving, canting, and lying, a mulct of some 1,000 guineas on the head of the old man for non-fulfillment of the disgusting compact. Was a widow or an orphan to be defrauded of their rights? The Hydra had lynx-like eyes at the command of the wealthy oppressor to find out flaws in deeds and settlements, whereby to reduce the poor creatures to beggary. Was a villain, who had cut his father's throat, to be turned loose on society. The Hydra only needed to be paid to do the job, by discovering that the criminal had been accused by a name of 4 letters, whereas it ought to have been spelt with 5. Nor were there wanting to the Hydra heads that would for a trifle call heaven to attest their belief in the prisoner's innocence, they well knowing him to be guilty all the while. There was one particular den which was the favorite haunt of this Hydra, where it was wont to display the most ill-favored and villainous of all the heads it bore. These heads were remarkable for being more particularly foul-mouthed, especially towards each other, than any of the rest. This den bore the name of Old Bailey. But the Hydra had been guilty of deeper and more sanguinary enormities than the above. Not only had it broken innumerable hearts, and driven countless victims raving mad, but it had strangled, decapitated, ripped up, burnt, broken alive, and destroyed by other lingering torments myriads of unfortunate persons, some altogether innocent, and all, except some few, more sinned against than sinning. The name of this Hydra was the Law. It was the offspring of necessity, by wickedness. Here now was a monster to be exterminated with all speed. But how? Hercules might have battered at its several heads to all eternity, for, as in the case of its prototype, as fast as one was knocked off, others, forthwith, shot up, as if by magic, to replace it. He knew, moreover, that the populace had, at different times, arisen and trampled this Hydra in the dust, but after having been to all appearance destroyed and annihilated, its disjointed limbs would reunite, and it would shortly be resuscitated in more than its former might. He further perceived, that so long as crime existed, it was a necessary evil. So Hercules determined to use his club as a reform club, though not the club in Pall Mall, to see if, in a social sense, he could not beat the knave out of doors. But first he launched a few arrows from his unerring bow at the monster, whereby he crippled and enfeebled it, preparatory to knocking it on the heads. These arrows were anointed with gall, which was of a black, inky nature, and the wounds which they made stung and rankled exceedingly. And the unction was in the form of written characters, and those characters made words, and those words sentences. Wherein was the sting of the arrows? Various things too numerous to recite were inscribed on the arrows of Hercules. Among them it was written that he who argued and employed oratory, being hired, for the purpose of willful deception, was a paid liar. That the willing tool of the swindler and the cheat was a scoundrel. That the person protracting by technical artifice a lawsuit respecting property, in order that he himself might derive the larger pickings from the same, was a legal pickpocket. That the abettor of a murderer, whether wearing a wig and gown, or a smock frock and ankle jacks, was an accessory after the fact. The arrows thus anointed were said to carry home truths, and they did marvelous execution on the body of the Hydra. Some arrows bore legends of a seemingly opposite I am port. As for instance, blessed is the hireling of the oppressor of the poor. To perplex and bother a witness, with the view of causing him to swear to an untruth, is an honest thing. It is very right and proper knowingly to garble statements and misrepresent facts, for so much. It was also set down upon these arrows, that under the protection of court to insinuate falsehoods, known to be such, against the character and motives of a plaintiff or defendant, was extremely brave and gentlemanlike. That it was noble and high-minded to employ ridicule against right, and to excite vulgar prejudices in behalf of wrong. Some of these sentences were of a slightly playful character, as that the silk gown of the venal pleader was by no manner of means a rap rascal. The point of the arrows thus armed were brighter and more sparkling than the rest, and these weapons had a tickling, irritating property, which occasioned much smarting to the reptile. A few of them were aimed at the more sensitive part of certain dull persons on whom the Hydra depended for its subsistence, but who by the tickling of the shafts were piqued and aroused into reflection. These arrows insinuated how sensible and creditable it was to be beguiled into enthusiasm against justice, by being addressed as a British jury, as men, parents, husbands, Englishmen, and so forth, by a crafty, fee-seeking, heartless knave, who all the while held the said British jury, and the men, parents, husbands, and Englishmen aforesaid, in profound and sovereign contempt. Other similar hints, equally delectable and flattering, they likewise bore, and by dint of them that worthy personage, Mr. John Bull, was edified to an extent that was surprising. A due number of volleys of arrows having been discharged by Hercules, the Hydra was observed to grow very sick and faint, and to pine exceedingly for lack of food, which people had begun to take all possible care to take out of its way. It was obviously in bad case, and it was evident that a very little would suffice to settle its business. Still, however, the demigod left it alone, and proceeded with his mighty club, and his sharp arrows, to demolish rascality in all its different varieties, his achievements forming other adventures which yet remain to be recorded. Villainy at last was eradicated from the earth, and the conqueror now advanced to give his enfeebled enemy, the Hydra, the finishing and fatal blow. It was needless. The monster had been starved to death, for roguery is the food of law. So Hercules had nothing to do but to tuck the creature up on his club, and to cut a caper of triumph before the people, even after the fashion of Mr. Punch, when he has accomplished his final victory over the enemy of man. Chapter 3. The Third Labor, How Hercules Captured the Buck of the Brazen Countenance. It is not to be supposed that Hercules could have gone on choking lions, crushing reptiles, and exterminating monsters in general, without attracting some attention. The public, in general, however, contrary to their accustomed behavior, to those who sought their good, whom they were wont to pelt, and hang, and poison, and persecute, unanimously called our hero a fine fellow. Hercules forever was chalked, painted, and printed up, on every dead wall and barrier. His more ardent admirers wanted to get him into Parliament, and several flags inscribed, "Vote for Hercules," were displayed from divers windows. All public houses entitled the Pillars of Hercules began to be much frequented, and at some of these, mystic games, called skittles, were instituted in his honor. Each shittle was fashioned in the shape of a human head, which bore a resemblance to some one or other well-known representative of a particular class of monsters, which, it was hoped, he would speedily overthrow. One day a procession headed by the Lord Mayor of London, and including all the members of the corporation, together with a large number of other tradesmen, craftsmen, and mechanics, waited with much form and ceremony on the hero. Hercules received them with great dignity, and on their spokesman intimating that he had something to say, graciously desired him to say on. Then the Lord Mayor pulled a paper out of his pocket, and putting his spectacles on his nose, gave a short cough, and read to the effect following: "May it please your divinity, whereas your mightiness in times past, as we are credibly informed by our reverend chaplain, and divers others, learned men and great clerks, was graciously pleased to pursue, entrap, and catch, a certain stag, of incredible swiftness, golden horns, and brazen broad feet, and to deliver the same, firmly bound and secured, into the custody of your mightiness's brother Eurystheus, which stag did crop, despoil, and lay waste the pastures and meadows of Annoy, to the no small damage and detriment of the shepherds and graziers of that region in the neighborhood. And whereas, now, a certain buck, or male deer, also with horns, to our cost richly gilt, and though not having feet of brass, yet being of a brazen face, moreover exceedingly swift, so that no man may catch him, and withal of extreme subtlety, doth, in like manner, bite, and devour the herbage of a certain field to us appertaining, commonly called the Field of Commerce, we, the undersigned, the Lord Mayor, Corporation, merchants, bankers, tradesmen, and others of the City of London, in the County of Middlesex, do humbly beg, entreat, and implore, your mightiness, that you would graciously vouchsafe also to pursue, catch, and entrap the said buck, and deliver the same, likewise firmly bound and secured, into the hands and custody of our sheriffs of London and Middlesex, to be by them dealt with according to the law in such case made and provided. And your petitioners, as in duty bound, will ever pray." Then followed a host of signatures. Hercules, having with much gravity and condescension, patiently listened to the above oration, politely requested his lordship to be more explicit, protesting that he could not, for the life and soul of him, comprehend what he had been driving at. Whereupon, the Lord Mayor being now out of breath, his clerk proceeded in terms rather less enigmatical to explain the object of the petition. He informed Hercules that the buck complained of was a human buck, the type or pattern of a genus, and that he derived his name from his outward man, which was what was commonly denominated a fashionable exterior, that is, the exterior of a buck. That the brazenness of his face was a metaphorical expression signifying its unchanging nature, and indicating singular coolness and imperturbability of mind. That the gold on horns represented booty and pillage, and was intended to distinguish him from certain other bucks whose horns were said to be green. That his nibbling and biting in the field of commerce meant divers depredations, which, by craft and stratagem, he perpetrated on the goods, chat telephones, and substance of commercial men. And that his great swiftness of foot related to a remarkable facility of absconding, by means of which, after playing off one of his tricks, he would transfer himself in less than no time to France or America, and that he had a great many disguises, military, naval, and foreign, and thus ended his speech. The hero affected for a few moments to be reading over the signatures. He was only thinking. Presently, he rose, and having glanced his penetrating eye over the deputation, delivered himself as follows. My Lord Mayor and gentlemen, I shall have much pleasure in acceding substantially to your request, and in doing my best to settle the hash, that is to say, the venison of this very troublesome and mischievous buck. You will please, however, to allow me to manage this matter my own way. As to consigning him to the custody of your sheriffs of London and Middlesex, I cannot undertake to do that, because it strikes me forcibly that the offices of those gentlemen will very shortly be sinecures, in which case I know you too well to suppose that you will continue them. So that you may expect, before any long time shall have elapsed, to have no sheriffs at all. Here the members of the deputation generally exchanged blank looks, and the visages of the civic dignitaries, some of whom gave audible grunts of dissatisfaction, became visibly inflamed, which Hercules, not marking, continued. Now, gentlemen, before I take any measures for the capture of this buck, I must insist upon a little exertion on your own parts with a view to protect this field of commerce, as you call it, from his depredations. I am not going to waste my immortal breath in chasing him for some 12 months, perhaps to no manner of purpose, and with the certainty of having to recommence my pursuit of some other individual of his tribe equally obnoxious with himself at the end of it. You must famish and debilitate him, gentlemen, him and all his kin, and then I will see what I can do for you. And now, attend. How is it, I ask, that this buck, or, as I may as well call him by his real name, swindler, is enabled to prey upon you? Why, you addle-brained, pudding-pated, turtle-witted noodles, because you are stupid enough to let him. How is it that you do not recognize him the instant you see him? Why, and you have been told this before, because your brains are in your breeches pockets. Do you suppose that every rogue has not his name written in his countenance for those who can read? It repels you from his eye, it disgusts you in his smirk, it grates upon your ear in his very voice. I am a demigod, but with half my wit, which is that of a mere man. I could detect a swindler instantly. For instance, here Hercules rose and pointed with his forefinger to an individual present. There is a swindler. Do you not see the snake, the vulture, and the fox branded in his every lineament? Do you not, I say? Hercules paused. Every eye was directed toward the object thus denounced. He was a Jew bill discounter. The creature looked as if blasted by a thunderbolt. His eyes were fixed and wide open, his face like whitewash, and his grinning lips livid as a mulberry. His knees knocked together, and his whole frame shook like a jelly in convulsions. Vanish, scoundrel, thundered the hero. The caitiff lost no time in obeying, and hastening frantically into the street, ran his head against a lamp post. He was taken up, laboring under concussion of the brain, and having been bled, physicked, and blistered accordingly, turned Christian on recovery, and gave away all he had to a hospital. There, resumed Hercules, I was right, you see. Now all you have to do to become just as good a physiognomist as I am, is just to devote a little of that time which you lay out upon your ledgers and day books to looking about you, studying mankind, and cultivating those mammon-muddled, dross-defiled, tuppenny-halfpenny intellects of yours. And, now, get out with you. So saying, Hercules descended from his throne, and catching up his footstool, flung it at their heads, which he afterwards belabored with his club to such purpose, that they speedily beat their retreat. Rubbing their pates, they made the best of their way home, and when they got there, took care to act upon his suggestions. The result was, that the race of swindlers in the course of a few months became quite extinct, all except one. He had been the great buck swindler of his day, but he was now become a mere starveling and tatterdemalion. Hercules, in taking a walk one day, caught sight of him through a dusty window, dining at a wretched eating house in the New Cut. The hero watched his opportunity, and as the sorry wretch, the shadow of his former self, was bolting, as Hercules foresaw that he would. Without having discharged his reckoning, he seized him, almost unresisted, by the collar. He would not commit him to a jail, well knowing that he would go out a greater rogue than he went in, and he considered the workhouse too bad even for a swindler. So having given him a wholesome taste of his emendatory club, he put a few guineas in his pocket and shipped him off to Australia.